Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to our Saddleback webinar this week. My name is Liz Mangus, and I'm a literacy specialist with Saddleback Educational Publishing. As you are logging in today, please locate your control bar, which is at the bottom of your web browser window. That's where you will find the chat, the Q&A, and the live transcript icons. So we do want you to chat with us today. We're going to have several points where we invite you to chat with us and share your thoughts. So it's very important, in order for this to work correctly, that you go to the chat and you select everyone from the drop-down menu, and then you can go ahead and make your comment. If you don't do that, then only a couple of people here at Saddleback are seeing your comment, and that's not really generating much discussion, and that's not very fun. So if you could right now go to the chat, select everyone from the little drop-down menu there, and just let us know where you're joining us from. It's always fun to see who is here. There's also a Q&A icon on the control panel. So that's where you can put your questions throughout our session today. And if you would like to take advantage of subtitles, please select live transcript and then click on show subtitles. All right, we'll get started right at about 3 o'clock Eastern time. We are on Twitter. Saddleback is on Twitter, and our presenter today, Dr. Margo Gottlieb, is also on Twitter. So we invite you to go there, follow us, say hello, let everybody know you are joining us for this great learning opportunity today. All right, let's say hello to Margo. How are you? Welcome back.
Thank you.
All right.
It's so nice to see people trickling in.
Yes, slowly but surely. All right, I'm going to go here to the chat and select everyone because I'll forget to. Hi, Dawn. Welcome. Let me put in hi, everyone. Yeah, once you click on everyone and send a message, it will default to everyone. So that's why we always encourage you to go there and do that now and just say hello. So that way, when it is time to chat, you're all set. Hello, Cornelia. And hello, Yoshiko. Welcome. All right, everybody, don't be shy. You know what? It is spring break for a lot of people. So if you are joining us from your home or your vacation spot, thank you very much. We are always excited that you take time out of your day to join us. And for those of you who catch us on the recording later on because you were, I don't know, in Miami Beach or something, welcome to you too. We're glad that you engage with us and come visit the Saddleback webinar platform every week. Hi, Karen. Hi, Susan. Welcome, welcome. Sarita, how's the weather in Michigan? Is it spring there yet officially? That's what I want to know. It's always winter up there can go into late April, which is not very pleasant. All right. Not on the beach today, Margo. Raining, cold, and snow. See, but we're into April now, so it should be breaking soon. I hope for everybody's sake up north that the cold and snow goes away and gives everybody some sunshine. So I'm in the Austin, Texas area, and it is a lovely day here today. I cannot complain. So, all right, welcome everybody. I know that with a lot of people being on spring break this week, that we might have more people catching the recording than are on with us live, and that's okay. No worries, no worries. All right, well, it is just about time to get started. So let me officially introduce our topic for today. The topic is bringing equity to classroom assessment for multilingual learners. Now, Margo and I were just talking before we started the broadcast about how the topic of assessment can feel a little bit heavy sometimes. It's not something that we always love to talk about, right? But it's important. It's important to talk about this. And we're so thankful that Margo is here to share her expertise. So if you don't know her, Margo Gottlieb is the co-founder and lead developer for WIDA at the Wisconsin Center for Education Research, University of Wisconsin-Madison. Her scholarship has focused on designing language development standards frameworks, co-constructing linguistically and culturally sustainable curriculum, promoting student agency through assessment, and evaluating language education policy. She has published extensively in journals and encyclopedias, as well as authored, co-authored, or co-edited over 30 books on language standards, academic language use, and classroom assessment. She also has a couple of new books out around this topic, which she'll be mentioning, and we'll put that information in the chat as we go. And that is it. Thank you for joining us, Margo, and I will turn it over to you.
Welcome, everyone. I'm so glad you were able to join us today. I understand it's a busy time all the time for everyone. And thank you, Saddleback. Thank you, Liz. You've been so wonderful in helping to organize this webinar. I truly appreciate it. And hopefully you'll be able to use this information and bring it back to classrooms, to districts, and think about how best to assess your multilingual learners. That's what it's all about. Not on a large scale basis, although we're going to touch on that, but what can you do day to day to bring equity into your classrooms? I'm really going to try to cover 3 areas in this hour. One is I'm going to let you engage in your own kind of self-assessment and determine to what extent there's equity in assessment practices for your multilingual learners. Then we're going to take that and look through the lens of equitable assessment for those students. And then finally, what are some strategies that you may take back to the classroom to advance equity for your multilingual learners from now to the end of the year, and then thinking even about next year? I'm going to ask you to help share what's happening in your particular setting along the way. So I hope you will join me. That'll be great. So every time you see blast, that means it's your time to really share with your colleagues who are out there around the country. If you were to define equity in a word or a phrase, what does it mean to you? Think about it. Now put it in the chat. What is equity? And what's equity as it applies to assessment?
All right, sometimes it takes a moment for the chats to come in. All right, I see impartial.
Okay, that's a good
That's a good one.
I like it.
Accessible for all, equal access or supported access to give opportunity to all, making sure that everybody is able to show their best understanding of materials, giving everyone access to opportunity, equity in assessment, emphasis on making it accessible. I think I missed one. No, that's it. Okay. Hi, Emily. Thanks for joining us. Equity allows all to have access, meet the student where they are, and assess on their progress. Thanks, everybody.
And all of you have hit the mark. I'm going to share with you some other ideas in just a minute. Now that you have this notion of equitable assessment for multilingual learners, I'm going to ask you 2 questions. Here's the first of them. On a continuum from 1 to 5, 1 being the minimal and 5 being most extensive, to what extent do you consider classroom assessment, not necessarily your own, but that you're familiar with? To what extent do you consider classroom assessment equitable in your setting, wherever you are, in whatever context you choose? Just write a number 1 to 5 in the chat.
All right, I'm seeing lots of 2s and 3s. I've got a 1. I'm seeing mostly 2s and 3s at this point. Keep it coming. Cornelia says, I have seen 1 through 5. Many are 3 at best. Sarita says 2. Interesting. So a wide variety here.
Isn't that nice? So, but at least we're off. We're off the starting block, right? And we're starting to move in a more equitable direction. So here's the second question I have for you. From 1 to 5, to what extent are your multilingual learners engaged in the process of assessment? What's their role? Is it minimal or extensive? What would you say?
Oh, that's interesting. Nicole says 1, 2. Lots of ones here. A 1.5 from Gail. Okay. All right.
I like that.
And we got a couple of 5s.
Oh, that's wonderful. So there is a range. Some of you are just beginning to think about how to incorporate the voices of your multilingual learners. Other for you is probably a natural extension of your classroom practices. So that's something to think about, because for me, unless multilingual learners are very much part of this equation, as we will see in just a little while. And you notice I say multilingual learners. I don't use English learners. I don't use emergent bilinguals. I just use multilingual learners. And to me, here's a broad definition. Children and youth in K-12, it can be pre-K, but in pre-K settings, in large part, they use the term dual language learners. Multilingual learners have been exposed to multiple languages, or they're learning in more than one language. And their learning can occur at home, in the community, or at school. So it's a more inclusive term. It accentuates multiple languages rather than just English. And to me, it's much more assets driven. It's more strength based. I hope you agree. Here's a general delineation of 3 categories of students, with which we're all aware. So English learners, for the most part, are those multilingual learners who've been identified as needing language support. There's a whole assessment system that helps I do this identification process. And here's just a couple of the subcategories. Long-term English learners who've been in programs for more than 6 years, SCIFE students who have had interrupted formal education, even gifted and talented English learners who are still in need of additional language support, recent arrivals, English learners with disabilities. These are students that you'll see later on are a subcategory that are part of ESSA compliance and requirements, ESSA being the federal law. Multilingual learners embrace all students, as I just defined, that are exposed to multiple languages. So we also are inclusive of heritage language learners who may only have a grandmother speaking a language other than English in the home. So the students in large part communicate in English, but they've been exposed to other languages. Students who have been exited or reclassified and no longer participate in language education programs, or other dual language learners who are coming from English-speaking homes and are learning Spanish or Korean or Mandarin as an additional language. And then English learners, multilingual learners, are couched within the greater student population, which are all other students. It's important to know kind of the place where multilingual learners sit, because those are the students we're really going to talk about today. So here we go. Oh, I already showed you the answers. Not that they're answers, they're just responses. So every time you see BLAST, I want you to think about a question. And this is the question of this slide. Put on your multilingual, multicultural lenses, and given your sense of equity, which very much has to do with access and opportunity, it seems, how might you describe your current assessment practices for multilingual learners? What is your notion of equity here? What's occurring in your classroom, your school, your district, your state? Or what have you seen? So,
all right, the answers are starting to come in.
Good.
Barbara says unrealistic.
Oh, interesting. I like
Karen,
that.
yeah, Karen says standardized. So that's an interesting response too. Very challenging, says Dawn. Gail says not equitable. Challenging, yeah. Afterthought, that's an interesting one. One size fits a few.
Okay.
Interesting.
So we're not even thinking about how to retrofit assessment. It's just not there, it sounds like, for those of you in the audience today. Interesting. Wow.
Yeah, time consuming. Cornelia says removing cultural connotations with which students may not be familiar. Not balanced.
I'm going to touch on many of these issues, but I'm going to negate the one response that said time consuming. For me, current assessment practices and those in the future that are within a classroom should be reflective of instructional practices. They should be one and the same with instruction. So it shouldn't be, it should be an extension of, it should be interwoven into what's happening already in a classroom. So we're going to talk about the different types of assessment, and that's where your answer may have come in. So here's just a couple of things. Do you consider them fair? Are they reflective of your multilingual learners, or experiences, or languages, or cultures? Are they linguistically and culturally relevant for your student population? So those are some considerations to take into account when we try to describe assessment practices for our multilingual learners. Overall, I would say envisioning equitable assessment practices at a classroom level, they center on and support the design of the instructional experiences for multilingual learners. Because if it's happening within your classroom and you have the control over assessment, first of all, you should invite your multilingual learners to be part of the process. Equitable assessment should be more student-driven than it is today. It should be centering on students. It should be culturally and linguistically sustaining, not an afterthought, I think, as somebody said, but thought of upfront. So what are the characteristics of our multilingual learners, and how can we advantage our multilingual learners in creating sound and equitable assessment practices? It should be responsive to our student strengths, all our students, in particular multilingual learners that today. And they should be inclusive of a range of perspectives, because each multilingual learner is unique, and we mean to bring in each and every multilingual learner into that process. So how might we do that? And this is where we're going to get to the notion of standardization, the notion of thinking about how assessment isn't reflective, it's not been negotiable. I'm going to go through each of 4 major types of assessment and showing how together they have to represent a comprehensive and balanced assessment system. So we're going to start off with annual assessment, assessments that occur once a year. And what we're going to try to do is give you some ideas as to how you might infuse more equitable practices, even within assessments that are externally imposed upon districts and schools. What can we do? So this is how we're going to begin. With annual assessment, you have to understand that with each type, there's a distinct purpose. There's a reason why these assessments take place, and the data they produce are relevant for the purpose for which the assessment has been designed. And it can't help you in a classroom if it's given once a year. It can give you an overarching 30,000 foot view. That's it. So the example of annual assessment are your state tests. Those in English language proficiency that occurs from kindergarten through grade 12, and your state tests of academic achievement, mainly English language arts reading. Luckily for some of you, it might be in languages other than English, and also mathematic testing. And we can't forget science, which is interjected 3 times during a student's career in school. But what are some of the characteristics? Annual assessment by nature is going to be high stakes in nature. It's going to have consequences for students, often for teachers in schools. Here's where the standardization, it has to be standardized, because you have to be able to generalize the results across classrooms, across schools, across districts to states. It's part of the natural fabric of an annual assessment. It's supposed to be distal to teaching and learning because it can't reflect each and every classroom. So it's pretty far removed from curriculum, but it must be psychometrically sound for the student population on which it has been normed. And this is where I think some of you were referring to, that if you look at a technical manual for state academic achievement tests, there's very few multilingual learners who have participated in that norming. And it might be reliable and valid for those students, but not necessarily for your multilingual learners. So there's 3 other types of assessment. Let's investigate those. Have a couple of slides before I get there though. What you can do to try to infuse equity somehow in your annual assessment is think about the application of the principles of universal design for learning. In recent years, accessibility principles have taken hold in a lot of state assessments, and they're much more aware of what is required from special student populations. But those principles can also be applied to multilingual learners in very specialized ways. So looking at these 3 principles, has to be multiple means of representation. And what I'm saying is that there are multiliteracies. Students are digitally literate. They are literate through not only written language, but through oral language. They interpret the world in different ways. And those ways have not been captured in large-scale assessment yet. Related to that are multiple means of expression. Are students just given a text-based multiple choice test and have to, their whole achievement is contingent on being able to interpret text? Or are they given instructions through oral expression? Are they able to look at graphic design? Are they able to look at visual reinforcement? Are they able to have tables to help them make meaning out of that written word? And then finally, the 3rd principle, are there multiple means of engagement for our multilingual learners? Little by little, there's a growing body of research that says we have to look at even annual assessment through a multilingual lens. That is, students, if they're coming with multiple languages, have the ability to access those languages when the stakes are high. So for example, in a large scale test, what students might be able to do is click on a word and have it translated for them. So they have multiple languages for inputting the information, processing that information, so they'll be able to answer in English. Another interesting article that's recently come out is that, let's think about the use of translanguaging. Is that a possibility in large scale annual assessment? There's much debate over that, but I thought at least I should mention it. We also can minimize bias and sensitivity issues. Every single state assessment must undergo this review on an annual basis. I put the little definition for you if you're not familiar with this concept, but bias and sensitivity is any variable or any factor that is going to impede or confound the results of assessment that are attributed to individual student characteristics. What can we do? How are we able to relate this to multilingual learners? Here's some ideas. If in fact you're reviewing test items, think about, is the sociocultural context appropriate for multilingual learners? Is there topic familiarity? Have our students even experienced this topic? Have they been exposed to the concepts that are being tested? Are they familiar with the genres, especially when it comes to language arts? And what about the density of language? Are we measuring language in an achievement test, or are we measuring the concepts? And so, for example, what's often used is the notion of nominalizations, used so frequently in English, that's going to consolidate language and make it more challenging for our multilingual learners. I'm going to give you an example. This was taken, believe it or not, from an assessment, a language arts assessment by a consortium many years ago. I want you to take 1 minute and read it. And as you read this little excerpt, it's about twice as long. It was intended for fourth graders, about Grandma Ruth. Think about potential areas of bias that you see in it, because I'm going to ask you about them. Just think of one or two and then put it in the chat. Liz, what has the audience come up with?
Well, they're still reading and processing. Here we go.
Sorry
They're starting
about
to come.
that.
Yeah, no, it always takes, sometimes it feels like awkwardly long, but that's just for people to process and then start typing.
And I
It usually takes a while.
Sorry about that.
No worries. Okay, Nicole says you need baseball context. The name Babe Ruth can be confusing and unfamiliar. Baseball for sure, Babe Ruth. Tissue paper, baseball is America's pastime. So just in general, background knowledge.
Right, the notion of sociocultural context is just not there for some of our multilingual learners. Right.
Playing with dogs. Oh, here's an interesting one. Playing with dogs as pets, not as protectors. So
good.
That's
I love that, because in other cultures, dogs are outside. They're not inside. They're not pets.
Very interesting. Yep. All right. I think that's about all we're going to get on this one.
Well, that's fine, because I have some more for you. Here we go. Do you notice? No visual support at all. So all you had to do is put a little baseball in there, it says Babe Ruth right on it. That would have been helpful. Baseball, you all got that. Assumes familiarity, playing catch, you caught that one. Familiarities, I'm sorry about that. With certain naming traditions. It's Grandma Ruth from Babe Ruth, which is not a usual tradition. Assumes understanding of the value of a signed baseball. What's a collector's item and why shouldn't you touch it? And why is it valuable? So there's multiple issues here at heart that will really impede understanding from our multilingual learners. So that's large scale assessment. Let's move on to interim assessment, and I'm going to go a little bit faster now. Its purpose, in large part, is to predict performance on annual tests. That's why it's there. So you don't have to wait once a year to get results, that if you give a test 2 or 3 times during the year, you'll have an inkling of how students might score at the end of the year or whenever the window is. In the example are most likely it will replicate what your annual assessment is like. So there's digitized achievement tests as well as digitized language proficiency test. If we look at the characteristics, most often it's commercialized. That is an off-the-shelf product. Again, externally imposed upon teachers, and most often selected by districts or schools, and very similar in format. So it's more like this practice test, more so than anything else. That's interim assessment, which is different from common assessment. So interim assessment is a form of common assessment, but for me, common assessment is different, and I'll share the characteristics in just a minute. But common assessment is a school-wide effort or a district effort, even a classroom practice to monitor student growth over time. And a couple of examples that I put down are grade level projects. If you use a uniform rubric, you can measure that growth over time. If you have that agreed upon criteria of success and should share them with your multilingual learners, you're on your way of having students participate in this process. So here are some of those characteristics. It is designed and developed in large part by leadership teams or professional learning communities with the locus of control with teachers. That means they are determining the destiny. They are very much a part of the design process. In doing so, they're able to focus on their local curriculum. What are the learning goals for particular projects of learning? And what is the evidence that is to be accrued over time and shown that will determine the student growth? Those are the major characteristics. So common assessment is coming at a school level across classrooms. That's the unifying definition of it. It occurs across classrooms. It could be at a grade level cluster. It can be at one grade level. It could be across 2 dual language immersion classrooms, but it involves more than one classroom. But when we look at, and here's the 4th type of assessment, classroom assessment, it is to move your individual teaching and your students' learning forward. It's very individualized. And the examples put here is that you want to document classroom routines that are idiosyncratic to what you do and matching your individual learning targets or objectives, some of you may use that term, to specific evidence that you expect your students to produce. Here's some examples of that. It's represented in everyday lessons as part of that lesson, not as an afterthought. Some of you may say, well, this is a assessment for formative purposes, and true it is, but I will show you a different kind of conceptualization of that same concept. It reflects variability of classrooms. It recognizes that every teacher and every group of students is unique, and it honors that. It places equity squarely in the hands of the teachers, but it best matches the features or the characteristics of your students. So I have a question for you now. What do you think? So we're looking at all 4 assessment types, starting from annual assessment to classroom assessment. Is your school or district's overall assessment system, do you consider it balanced, or is the scale tipped in one direction? What would you say?
Oh, that's a really interesting question. And I definitely have my predictions on how people are going to respond to this. So it'll be interesting to see. We're still waiting for the chat to start going here.
And that's fine.
Okay. Dawn says tipped in one direction for sure. Karen says tipped to annual and interim. And I'm starting to see that come up. It is tipped toward interim assessment. Oh, Rowena says balanced in her district. So that's great.
Nice.
That's great. I love to hear that. Yeah, it seems like annual and interim are, it seems to be the most common answer. And then we have a couple of people saying pretty balanced where they are.
Great, because annual and interim assessment, one is equated with accountability, and accountability in large part happens only in English. And so we get pushback when we try to think about common assessment and classroom assessment that should be reflective of multiple languages, because we have multiple languages present in our classrooms from our multilingual learners. So let's think about this. I'll let you contemplate this more than anything else. So there are some strategies for promoting more equitable practices for our multilingual learners at annual and interim types of assessment. So my number one suggestion, become friends with a data coach and together interpret information from standardized large scale annual tests, but think about it through the lens of multilingual learners. Some of the caveats that I threw in at the beginning of the webinar. Suggest having school-wide professional learning around assessment literacy. So you extend the notion of assessment beyond just annual assessment or interim to embrace all four types. If you can, volunteer to serve on a school, a district, or state level committee representing and advocating for your multilingual learners and their families. And if you can, volunteer to chair a task force on developing a language policy for instruction and assessment, either for common assessment across the school or a classroom assessment for your multilingual learners. So all in all, it can become more balanced. And more than anything else, you have to advocate for all things multilingual in order to empower your students, give them agency for their own learning. It can be done. Start thinking about it now for next year. However, I see movement. It is starting to happen. And some of you are saying, oh my heavens, we have a balanced system. How do you maintain that balance? So those of you who are still at the kind of the left-hand end of that continuum, or the scale is tipped in one direction, think about how you might move away from having multiple choice tests or multiple choice items at the end of a chapter. Think about how you can move away from having scores or numbers or a percent correct. What in the world does that mean for your multilingual learners? How can they be actionable as to improve teaching and learning? Because ultimately that's what classroom assessment is all about. And the feedback is very nondescript. Good job. Well, what do you do with good job? What do I do next? Smiley face. Well, that's nice. It's a little sign of encouragement, but now what do I do? We're all on the, the way to improve instruction and learning. So here's some things we might do. Instead of having just multiple choice that's going to yield these numbers and scores, have a time to set with your multilingual learners and all students criteria for success. If we're going to choose standards referenced assessment or assessment based on the concepts within a unit of learning, what are the expectations and how are our multilingual learners expected to reach those expectations? Always include personal reflection on the part of your multilingual learners. That would be self-assessment or even peer assessment, which would be interaction with others, and provide feedback that is timely, concrete, and actionable for students so they know what they have to do to improve what they have done. So let's think about it. More than anything else, in order to move towards this more balanced approach for assessment, shift agency to stakeholders. So rather than relying on these numbers or letters or scores, think about your multilingual learners. Think about your interaction, you as teachers or coaches or principals, administrators, your interaction with multilingual learners and their families, and think about how you can collaborate with your own colleagues, because that should be more important and have more force in making decisions than numbers. And so what that might look like, well, hopefully it will empower you as teachers and empower students, because in order for assessment to be equitable, it has to be reflective of equitable instruction, and it should be an empowering experience both for you as educators and all your students, including your multilingual learners. So I'm going to spend a little bit of time speaking to the role of multilingual learners through the lenses of 3 approaches. And I call these assessment of learning, for learning, and as learning, with emphasis on learning, not on the assessment. Assessment is the vehicle for learning. And so we're going to take those 3 sets of stakeholders and say, in large part, assessment as learning centers on multilingual learners and all other students. They are the focus. For assessment for learning, it's the interaction. It can be among collaborators, and those collaborators are partnerships, can be between students and teachers or teachers and teachers. And assessment of learning also involves administrators in supportive roles. One thing I haven't really spoken to, but of a very sound belief, that in order to enhance equity for multilingual learners, they need to have opportunities and access. I think those are 2 words that many of you put in the chat before, in their multiple languages. So how can you do that, even though you may be monolingual? How can you give permission for your multilingual learners to interact in multiple languages? First of all, think about how to leverage your students' and families' histories, tradition, and lived experiences. Ask students to go home and speak to someone to get a sense of that conceptual understanding in a culture other than one that's Anglo-centric. Think about how to bring in the students' personalized traditions or histories and connect that to the theme or the concept of the day. Think about how to incorporate your multilingual learners' interests, their languages and cultures into everything you do. Jumpstart each and every lesson by asking, even if it's obscure, asking how your students can relate to the topic of the day. Invite your multilingual learners to interact with others in the same partner language. Generally speaking, there's more than one multilingual learner who is from that language. Pair them up sometimes. Let them feel that they are important, that they can have confidence in their learning because they are sharing their experiences with children from that same language. And then finally, offer opportunities for multilingual learners, especially those that are literate in their other languages, to investigate topics in that language, or have them be read to in languages other than English. So there's a lot of ways that we can bring in equity without feeling that, oh my gosh, I can't do it because I'm monolingual. So what can we do? In large part, curriculum is still very much text-based. Here's some ideas for bringing in multilingual learners and encouraging them to think about researching topics using multimodal resources, including their home language. Have them listen to a story, a podcast, a webinar, YouTube, even TikTok. How can they research topics that aren't totally print dependent? Have them take notes or even sketch notes or draw a graphic organizer to help them in the languages of their choice. And then finally, how can they make outlines or drafts of an essay or of a project using multimodal resources? Again, not totally relying on language, but bringing in visual, graphic, even kinesthetic ideas if they're going to perform, let's say. Your turn. How might you consider multilingual learners' use of multiple languages for assessment or for instruction? Because as I said before, instruction is assessment for me. It's constant, ongoing. What are some things that you've seen or you've done?
They can answer in their home language is the first answer we've received.
Good.
That's
And
a
there's
great
always
answer.
translators around, I'm sure, in your classroom. And they love to do that because they're translating when they go to the clinics with their family members, I'm sure.
Right. And Alexandra says translanguaging techniques. So
Yes.
I think that's, I was thinking that most of the answers would be along those lines. So Gail says using sketches and drawings to support evidence of learning and translanguage. Drawing
Absolutely.
pictures, storyboards. Great answers, everybody.
Definitely. And I'm really not going to touch too much on translanguaging today, but to me, it's critical to bring that into the classroom, and you make a classroom pact with your multilingual learners, because translanguaging means different things to different teachers and families and districts. So think about what kind of policy, what are the practices in your classroom? Have set up some parameters for translanguaging, so it'll go smoothly in your particular setting. Here's some more ideas. Your multilingual learners can use their multiple languages to clarify understandings of a concept or to reinforce concepts, even in small groups with who share that partner language. They can dive deeper into concepts, because if they can't express themselves to the extent of the knowledge they have for that concept, it'll be much more meaningful if they can engage in their other language. Form relationships, and that's so important, especially, I was going to say this post-COVID world, we're not exactly out of the COVID crisis yet. So how can they reinforce each other through partnerships? And then lastly, to me, use of their multiple languages is really going to impact the shaping of their identities and being able to validate who they are, which is of critical importance. We know that social emotional learning is playing a major role now in education, and that's one way of bringing in our multilingual learners. So with assessment as learning, it's controlled in large part by the students themselves and given opportunities to reflect on their own learning, whether they're going to keep a journal, whether you have them write little notes. There's a myriad of ways in which they are always reflecting on how they learned, what were they challenged by in learning, what did they feel good about, what would they like to learn next. Here's some examples. So just looking at the picture, to me, both children are engaging in learning, and they're assessing their ability to be able to produce this science experiment with results. So in assessment as learning, our goal is to empower students, because ultimately we want them to become independent learners. We want them to have voice and choice, and we want them to be agentive. We want them to have agency and control over their own learning, because each and every one of our multilingual learners is indeed with superpowers, and that needs to be brought out. How might you do that, you ask? Here's some ideas. Have students keep interactional checklists, and it could be based on the expectations for that day, or your language target, or your content target. And I like to use integrated language and content targets. That would be great. To what extent, depending on the age of the student, they can have this little checklist, or they can have a rating scale. What is your self-assessment journey into this project or into the lesson? Have them keep entries, and it isn't something they have to submit at all. And that's where translanguaging is going to come in. Because if they're learning concepts in English, it will probably be writing in English. If they're learning concepts in another language, they'll use that language. And if they're literate in multiple languages, they'll be using both. So that's where it's to be applauded. Have students create self-reports that speaks to their metalinguistic and metacultural awareness. To what extent do they see their other languages when they're writing English? And conversely, when they're learning English, do they see their other languages kind of inserted? In Romance languages, it's much easier, obviously, than in Asian languages, but they still can become aware of the meanings across languages and across cultures. And that's what it's all about. So let's move on to assessment for learning. And that's where we're building relationships between teachers and teachers and teachers and multilingual learners. We want them to have multiple pathways to learning. And in doing so, to discuss options for providing that evidence of learning. We all want to achieve the same goals, but we have to acknowledge that depending on our multilingual learners, there are distinct pathways and multimodal ones to achieve that goal. What that TV little monitor says is so important, that you as an educator in enhancing and in growing your multilingual learners want them to be able to tune into their own interests and their passions and pursue them. My particular son, passion is cars. No matter what topic you introduce, he sometimes gravitates to cars. So I learned over the years, if I wanted to hear about X, I'd always introduce cars in some way. Try that with your multilingual learners and their own passions. Here's an example of assessment for learning. It's very much driven by feedback. So you and your students will know the next steps. And there's a co-construction process. So knowing where the students are, you and the student can sit through a student-led conference or just a conversation and say, I saw that you could do this. How can we build on this so we can just go a little further and get to X? So I think this cartoon is very reminiscent of feedback. I taught my dog to whistle, and his friend says, well, I don't hear him whistling. And his friend goes, well, I said, I taught him. I didn't say he learned it. Unless our students can show that they've learned it themselves and don't have you grading them, that they can say, I think I did this because I see that I have met these criteria, or I have collected this kind of evidence, then we will have assumed that assessment is working. With assessment of learning, that's where we're going to bring in administrators and coaches and counselors together with teachers, but not forgetting our multilingual learners. So through planned learning, planned time together, or through a PLC, how can you design final products for units of learning? How together can you decide on rubrics that's going to help interpret student work? And then finally, how can you, as a grade level or a school, really celebrate what your multilingual learners and all your students are accomplishing? Because we do want to celebrate our student success. Assessment of learning, again, as learning is going to happen minute by minute, and for learning might happen week by week. Of learning might correspond with, as I put here, a unit of learning, more long-term projects or products. Having students contribute to, a monthly newsletter or create a blog or participate in a podcast, or having a classroom website or a school level website, and be able to, again, be part of that. Have them participate in performances. So many of you have end of year kind of performances. Think about that as assessment of learning with your multilingual learners, saying, this is what I want to do. This is what I can do. This is what I'm going to show all my other peers what I have learned in English, but I'm also going to show them how proud I am of my other languages and cultures. So it's almost the end of the school year, and I thought I'd share with you what you might think about doing over the next couple of months. One is to think about the criteria for success that you have or your grade level team has for end of year samples. So it's going to be cumulative. You're in fourth grade. What are your fourth grade expectations? Then how might you, over the next 6 weeks or so, collect oral, written, and multimodal samples of student work, or ask your multilingual learners, what particular do you want to write about based on, we've covered all this in the curriculum this year, and have them use one, or if you accept translanguaging, which is perfectly fine with me, use translanguaging across each and every content area. So you're collecting content-based samples. But don't forget, give your students opportunities to reflect on each sample, to express their feelings about their work. What has this year meant to you? Have you gone from, hybrid to face-to-face situations? How has that impacted what you've done in school? What's been most exciting? What's been most challenging for you this year? And in which content areas? Where do you want to go to next? And then finally, how might you consider co-creating a paper or an electronic portfolio? Or it could just be simplistic as a folder for each student. Older students can take more ownership, obviously, than younger ones, and have them create a little table of contents and a cover sheet to share with family members and next year's teachers. So I'm running out of time. I'll give you one more opportunity. What is one new assessment related idea that you might consider using with your multilingual learners?
All right, let's see what we come up with.
And I know I've been talking very quickly, so I understand if you're still processing.
As people are thinking about their answers, I wanted to share that while I was listening to you, it made me think of a webinar we had on last summer of newcomer teachers who implemented project-based learning at their newcomer academy.
Nice.
And there were a lot of, there seemed to be a lot of overlap in what they were doing and the reasons behind that decision with what you are sharing here today. Nicole says, I need to give more student voice to my assessments.
Nice.
Karen says, and see, now they're starting to come in very quickly. Rowena said, I had my students participate in making digital snapshots with their information and examples of their work for teachers.
I love that. And I'll add to the snapshot with their portrait, that they should create a portrait of who they are, the languages they use, when they use it, how they use it, why it's important. End the year with that if you haven't done it at the beginning.
She says that's a great idea. Alexandra says, allow multimodality in assessments. We had a couple of people who work with adults who also wanted to chime in. Karen says, I would like to survey them about those last questions about what they liked, didn't like, found exciting and challenging. Victor says, Margo, I appreciate the professional outline presented today. It reflects a lot of what we're doing and need to do. Continuous improvement. Love it. Thank you. So some
nice.
feedback there.
And so I just have just a minute or so. So what I want to say is that we're in the midst of a paradigm shift. It seems like we're always in some kind of paradigm shift. But for me, I see this multilingual turn really starting to take hold in the educational landscape. And it's starting to influence assessment policy little by little. What can you do? This isn't a blast. I just want you to think about it. What can you do to leverage, highlight, celebrate the multiple languages and cultures of your multilingual learners? That they aren't an afterthought, like some of you said at the beginning, that they are really the centerpiece of instruction and assessment. So if you want to learn some more information, I just happen to have written a couple of books on this subject. On the left-hand side, I go much more in depth in classroom assessment in multiple languages. What can that look like, even if you're monolingual? And then on the right-hand side, assessment in multiple languages is for school and district leaders. And it's got a lot more policy and what you can do to influence that policy so it's in line with what's important for classroom assessment for your multilingual learners. So thank you, Liz and Saddleback again for this wonderful opportunity. I've so enjoyed being with you today.
Thank you so much for visiting with us again. We do have a couple of questions.
Oh, great.
But before we do that, let me let everybody know who and what is coming up for next week's webinar. So next week we have Dr. Katie Welch joining us to discuss translation tech tools. Now, it's been a while since we've done a tech tool type of webinar. And so we're excited to welcome Katie to the webinar platform to talk about parent communication in the home language. Very important. So we're excited for this one. We hope you will join us. This will be next week, Thursday, April 14th, 12 o'clock Pacific, 3 o'clock Eastern. You can register on our website, or you will be receiving an email as well, prompting you to register. And we are excited and hope to see you next week. All right. So, don't forget, our new Go SEL Literacy Library for tweens is now out. This is to help our tweens master social and emotional skills. Go ahead and contact me if you need more information or would like some samples. We just did a brief webinar on this a few weeks ago too. For more information, you can check that out on our YouTube channel. All right. So the question that came in was from Yoshiko, who wants to know, how would we make it equitable, not only in the assessment context, but also the whole school experience, if multilingual learners may not be on a spotlight by receiving the support we've discussed here today? So this is a very big question. So if the multilinguals are not receiving those sorts of supports that we discussed here today, how could we, I guess, draw attention to the fact that the entire experience needs to be equitable and not just assessment?
You have to be a warrior. You have to always have your multilingual, multicultural lens on. And everything you do in your classroom, in your school, in your district, make sure that you are the spokesperson and the advocate for your multilingual learners. Whether it's instruction, assessment, playground activities, whatever is happening in your setting, you always are looking on behalf of your multilingual learners. And little by little, you'll be gaining ground with your colleagues, I would hope, and start the snowball rolling.
Thank you for that. I'm just checking the chat to make sure that we don't, another question came in. Emma says, how can we leverage assessments when students complete them in Spanish when we are not able to grade their work in Spanish? I've certainly been scaffolding for my students to be able to show what they know in English, but it is frustrating.
And I understand that if you don't know Spanish, but I would assume that there are other students who do know Spanish, that there is other faculty that know Spanish, that there's a community member. If you want to increase family engagement, get them involved. That's something else to think about, how you can use translation, although I believe in trans-adaptation, that's another webinar, to think about all the resources you have to bring in a community member to help you out. So spread the word across your community. Just don't feel like I'm frustrated because I don't know this language. If there's students of that language group, there's community resources out there too.
there's a little bit, there are some people jumping in here on this too. And the person who asked that question, Emma, in her case, it's not a situation of her not knowing the language. It sounds like it's more of a policy thing. So that's a different conversation. This goes back to, I mean, it's not an easy answer, but it goes back to the warrior piece, you know?
Right. And little by little, dual language education, if you're in a dual language immersion situation, means bilingualism and biliteracy. So that's the ultimate goal. So both languages need to be present, or should be present ultimately.
Yeah, Emma, that is super frustrating. She says we aren't allowed to use translation to grade work since it is not considered quote unquote grade level work. That's
It should be grade level work. And are you measuring conceptual development or language development?
there you
So
go.
again, what's the purpose?
Yeah, that's great questions. Great point, Emma. I wish we had a simple answer for you, but that's extremely frustrating. Keep plugging away and being that advocate for your students. So we have time for one more question and then we will wrap it up. Gabriella wants to know about ideas for special education and multilingual students. And before Margo chimes in here, my 2 cents on this, for whatever it's worth, is when we broaden the assessment and bring equity to assessment, I think it works across the board, right? So I don't know.
Absolutely. It's very inclusive of multilingual learners with learning disabilities or any kind of disability.
Yeah. So I don't know that there would necessarily be a separate like menu of suggestions
No, I
for that
would
population.
use the same set of suggestions, except be more attuned to the individual quote disability of that student when you apply multimodality to instruction and assessment. Make sure whatever's applicable to instruction carries over to assessment or is embedded within the assessment.
Thank you so much, everybody. We've kept you a little bit longer than we normally do, so we are going to wrap it. No, that's okay. We had some great questions coming in. Thank you for joining us. Thank you, Margo, for taking the time to present this information.
I surely enjoyed it.
And we appreciate all of you joining us today, and we hope to see you on next week's webinar. Thank you so much, and we'll see you next week. Take care, everybody.
Gracias.
Bye-bye.
Bye now.